This project vlog has a tragic story. Come along on my creative journey in designing and fashioning a new Florentine Renaissance gown known as a Gamurra. Accompany me through all of the sometimes frustrating stages, from research, conception, and patterning, through to construction and finishing. There will be plenty of lessons learned and cheeky commentary along the way. First up, a little history. In 1468, Lucrezia de' Medici, the matron of the Medici clan, wrote to her son Lorenzo about a prospective future bride, the very noble and elegant Clarice Orsini of the powerful Roman Orsini clan. In the letter, she talks about having gotten the chance to see Clarice in her Gamurra and praised the young woman's figure as being shapely and, of course, most importantly, capable of bearing the next generation of Florence's unofficial princes. In fact, Lucrezia's assessment proved to be quite correct. Clarice gave birth to 11 children in 10 years, some of whom sadly didn't survive. The gown in question, though, was the Gamurra, the quintessential woman's garment of the Italian Renaissance. When people, even poorly informed Hollywood costume designers, imagine Italian Renaissance gowns, it is nearly always the Gamurra that they are envisaging, forming part of the foundation of a woman's ensemble for almost 100 years. This elegant, sophisticated layer served not only a practical function, but also served to promote a family's reputation, their onore, as it is called in the language of the time. As a well-gowned Contessa, I have a wide array of gamurre and cotte, but in truth, I haven't made a new one in 8 years. And the ones I have are literally wearing thin. Not exactly the best way to promote my comital onore. Although, if anyone examines my bodice that closely, they had better be a lady in waiting, or they may come to regret their life choices. Just saying. And so, back in July of 2022, as I prepared to attend a 2-week medievalist festival called Penzik, I decided that I needed a nice new Gamurra. And I wanted to draft a new pattern based on my most recent learnings of the gown in question. I mean, I had a week before the event, so plenty of time to draft and fit a new pattern, cut out all of the layers, and sew everything by hand, of course. Yeah, sure. I bet you can see where this is going. So let me start by saying that this project vlog has a tragic beginning. All of the footage of the initial stages, the patterning, the cutting, the fabric choices, the initial stages of sewing, all of the planning, that all ended up vanishing because the hard drive that contained them got corrupted before I had a chance to copy everything over, and the hard drive recovery company that we used ended up destroying the drive without actually recovering a single useful thing. Literally, we had 1,000 2-second files of footage. It was great. Anyway, thus no more footage of those stages. So, let me walk you through the crucial initial phases of the process retrospectively with as much flair as I can manage. Okay, first off, this garment is intended to be a recreation of a Gamurra dating to the 1480s in the Florentine fashion. Now, I knew that I wanted to rework the pattern that I had created based on a better understanding of the base construction of the Gamurra. The one I'd been using for 20 years was founded on a misunderstanding of a later version of the dress, and it had a seam in the front that really it just cannot be justifiably documented to my chosen era. So, great time to start fresh. Thus, after quite a bit of drafting and fiddling, I devise a bodice pattern that looks like this, designed to conform to my oddly shaped torso. You see, my left and my right half are not even vaguely symmetrical, with one side of my ribcage bulging much more than the other. And in fact, it turns out this might be true of many women. And sometimes I take this difference into account in my patterning, and sometimes I surrender to my inner pig dog, as they quaintly say in German, and just accept that there will be some discrepancies in how things sit. And sometimes my bodices are sturdy enough to enforce bilateral conformity. So if you are creating or fitting your own pattern, you might want to take bilateral torso differences into account. And then, if you do, you need to pay special attention to cutting and assembling the parts of your bodice, lest you cut or sew 2 of the wrong piece and you end up with something that doesn't fit any part of your body, really. Although, that being said, The sewing gods do demand habitual offerings from sewists in the form of tears and ripped seams and resewn seams. So this will happen to you at some point, just accept it. Sort of the same way that blood will be shed. And if you don't shed blood while making a dress, the dress is cursed. Take my word for this. Anywho, in this process, I also redraft my sleeve pattern, taking into account minor fitting issues from 21 years of wearing gowns with this sleeve tight. Now, part of my goal with this Gamurra is to make it much less annoyingly fiddly than my most recent cotta. In fact, many of you may know this dress. I'm aiming to simplify the dressing process for those very sad and yet frequent times when I am senza dama di corte. And the sleeves are definitely part of that simplification. The goal is to have minimum lacing while still allowing for alluring puffs of white linen to show through. After all, a quattrocento lady needs must show tantalizing bit of her underwear. Now, that doesn't mean no lacing, but it needs to be lacing that I can do with one hand by myself. Cheeky self-promotion time. If you are enjoying this video, please hit the thumbs up and subscribe and the notification bell if you want to know when I launch new things. And if you want to do more to support my work, then consider the super thanks button on YouTube or maybe becoming a patron on Patreon, which comes with a whole host of perks and extras like access to premium tutorials, multiple hour ones in fact, and discounts on classes. And now back to your regularly scheduled Contessa. Okay, having the bodice and the sleeves drafted, it is time to choose the fabrics. Now, I have a significant store of fabrics, silks, linens, wools, in all sorts of weaves and densities, purchased from drapers during various sales, because I'm a bit of a fabric hoarder, shall we say. Anyway, I have a particular choice of fabric in mind for this project, that being this beautiful red wool. Oh, what's that, dear viewer? That looks pink rather than red? Yeah, well, you would be correct. I ordered this wool, which was advertised as a fire engine red on eBay. Now, it was specifically intended to make a functional fantasy cloak for my 14-year-old son. Pink, while I love the color and on men too, it is definitely not my son's color and he doesn't fit with his taste at all. So this wool has sat for the last 2 years untouched, awaiting the right project. And now is its moment. Now, I know many of you, especially in warmer climes, are chortling and stating explicitly how you could never wear wool because it's too humid where you live. But hear me out. Not all wools are created the same. This here is more of a summer weight wool. Its weave is fairly loose and it has a lovely twill pattern. This wool will not only breathe, but will work with my linen camicia, my chemise, to draw heat and moisture away from my skin. Best yet, wool repels odors and stains, which is good for me because I stain my clothes easily. So no matter how much I sweat while dancing, it will resist my body's assault. I have worn wool in balmy, swampy heat, including southern summers and even during the hottest Pennsic days, and have been perfectly comfortable, or as comfortable as I would be even without any clothing on. So hashtag give wool a chance. Next up, the lining fabric or fabrics, which brings us to the topic of evidence of construction of these gowns. There are, sadly, vanishingly few extant garments from the 15th century in Europe, full stop, let alone from Italy. However, more and more are coming to light as church crypts are open for restoration work, as archaeological exploration is conducted, and as institutions also figure out what they have in their storerooms that maybe have just been sitting there for the past several hundred years. So enter then the Gamurra of the Blessed Osana, a nun who died in 1505. She was considered so saintly and holy that the gown in which she entered the convent was preserved. Okay, well, minus large chunks of the skirt, which were probably divvied up as holy relics, so yeah. Anyway, this dress is dated to the 1460s. The gown is made from a very fine white wool and constructed very beautifully. And pertinent to our topic of the bodice, it is lined in a heavy white linen. Now, Osana was a tween when this was made for her, maybe an early teenager, early adolescent. It did not need to provide any sort of torso support. In fact, it's very clearly aimed at someone with a flat chest. So it is not interlined or padded in any way, but I would like some more support for my bodice. So I'm going to interline it in a heavy white linen and line it in this luxurious blue linen. Now, some fashion historians or historical costumers claim that linen only came in the color of white in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. But we know this to be absolutely not true. For instance, the Irish were renowned for their saffron-dyed linea and also other saffron-dyed linen bits here and there. And we also have extant blue linen from at least the 9th century through to the 16th century, dyed in either woad or indigo. Not to mention documentary evidence. I have found a household account from Florence for a set of livery in green linen. Side note, dyeing with woad or indigo involves the use of fermented urine, the only source of ammonia in this period. Curiously, the dyeing manuals from the era recommend the urine of someone who has had strong drink, which would explain why dyers often sourced their urine from taverns, who in turn had urinals hanging from their walls to collect the horrifyingly precious substance. You know, like those clay urinals we find in all the fun medieval pottery places. That's what they were used for. Anywho, clearly the relative rarity of evidence is not proof of a negative in the case of dyed linen. And we even have a blue and white linen and wool gown from Italy dating to the mid-16th century whose hem is finished entirely in a blue linen band. So, aside from examples of blue linen having been used for lining, this particular blue linen constitutes scraps that I have in my stores, which makes this, in my opinion, a very authentic application of fabric from a medieval standpoint. Waste not, want not, after all. As for the sleeves and lining them, I decide to go with just the blue linen lining rather than adding the white linen interlining because I'm not certain. I don't remember my logic. That footage is gone forever, but that is the decision I make based on the fact that that's the sleeve that I have now. So maybe it's to keep the gown as summer friendly as possible. I don't know. It's a decision I may come to regret because I may actually want that extra stiffness in the sleeve as I think about it now, but whatever. Okay, well, time to lay it all out and cut. Now, remember that this wool has a twill pattern, one that reflects light differently on one side versus the other, in the direction it lays. So in laying out the pattern pieces and cutting things out, I need to keep that in mind to create a consistent look in the bodice and the skirt. Otherwise, I'm going to end up with panels that look like they're lighter or darker than other when they really aren't. Nevertheless, I still work super hard to minimize the waste by placing the fabric pattern pieces as close to each other as possible and, maximizing the use of geometry in accomplishing that. For the linen lining and interlining, on the other hand, I couldn't really care about fabric direction. My goal there is simply to maximize the use of fabric because in the case of this tabby woven linen, there is no direction. Now, for the skirt pieces. Osanna's gown, the only extant 15th century Gamurra of which I'm aware, is of a style with only minor gathering in the back and a few pleats that I suspect were intended to offer room for growth because the interior seams also have extra room built into them. And the skirt of her gown consists of trapezoids. Now, the waist of my Gamurre are all pleated because this is clearly indicated in all portraits of women from Florence in this era. In fact, I've actually been cutting the skirt panels of my Gamurre as trapezoids ever since I started down my Florentine journey. The trapezoid shape minimizes the amount of fabric that must be gathered into the waist while allowing for a wonderfully long hemline and stylishly full skirts as indicated in the frescoes that depict real ladies from Florence in full length. What's more, these trapezoids also create a gorgeous flare when dancing, which would definitely be the desired effect in the 15th century Italian mindset. After all, clothing acted as a display of a family's power, their onore, and the dance floor served as a vivid stage for this. Next up in our thought process, the lining of the skirt. Now, I have never found documentary evidence for lining the skirt of a Gamurra or a cotta from this era, fully at any rate. But that is how I have designed my Gamurre until now. So, lacking that evidence, I plan on taking a different approach to this gown, one that is fully documentable in how Osanna's Gamurra is constructed and finished. You see, the skirts of her gown actually feature lining in linen down to about hip length, in pretty much the same linen that is used to line the bodice. So I'm using more of my blue linen to cut out 4 trapezoids for the skirt that will reach down to my hips. Okay, we now have almost all of our components cut out. Just one last item, famous last words. How to finish the hem. Perhaps, rather uncreatively, I am once more resorting to the hem finishing method on Osanna's gown and also actually most Italian gowns of the 16th century, that being long strips of fabric. This method is wonderful on multiple levels. One, it allows for a protected hem edge that lacks any sort of unappealing bulk of a double hemmed edge. Two, it protects not just the hem, but also the bottom several inches of the gown from wear and tear and filth. This is what it looks like, for instance, when a hemline takes a beating without this protection. The strip can then be easily replaced whenever it becomes too worn out, leaving the fashion fabric in a, well, relatively pristine state. And I say relatively because remember that in 15th century cities, it's gross out there with a 100% chance of feces. Yeah, think about that for a moment. Now, I have stared long and hard at the edges of Osanna's Gamurra in pictures, as I haven't had a chance yet to see it in person on the bucket list. Anyway, it looks as though this piece is not cut on the bias. You can see the slate gathering all the way around to account for the straight edge. There could be several reasons for using a straight grain strip instead of a bias cut strip. One, fabrics of this era were not very wide. 30 inches at most. So one would have to cobble together many pieces to get the amount of length, creating more points of weakness in the form of stitches and seams. Not to mention the increased labor, which might be prosaic, but still a consideration. Secondly, it looks as though the selvage has been utilized specifically for this purpose. The selvage, you see, is thicker and therefore more resilient, against wear and tear and drag, which would provide greater protection for the bottom of the gown. Third, the gathering necessary at the top of the straight grain strip to fit into the trapezoid shape will actually create some extra push, some extra bulk, which will help cause the skirt to stand out from the body in that sort of, alluring flare fashion. Also, in the case of Osanna's gown, unlike later sottane, the strip of fabric seems to be of the same cloth as the fashion fabric. So, long strips of wool it is, which is no problem because how I laid out the trapezoids. Well, everything is cut out. Time to start assembling. Because, I plan to get this done in a week, more or less. On our next thrilling episode, we will, hopefully finish this thing. So if you have any questions about the process or my choices, drop them in the comments below. What about you, dear viewer? Have you made a Gamurra? What was your biggest learning or learnings? Please do share. I love chatting up about, clothing and geekery. Otherwise, until next time, stay creative and stay tuned for your moment of kitty zen. Bye, everyone.
Meow. Meow. Meow.
Was watching me pass by.
Meow. Flick that tail. Meow.